Are you guys ready for another computer build? My name is Carey Holzman, and this is DIY Garage. The system we're building today is actually going to a client who is probably a lot like you. We've got a mom and a dad and a son, and they all are going to share this computer in the family. Now, Dad wants to be able to do some invoices for his home-based business. Mom needs to do some accounting for her job. And the son, well, he wants to play video games, and probably Dad does too. So we've got a budget to work with within to meet these needs, and with that information, I've selected the following parts. For the case, we've selected the Corsair 500R. This is a mid-tower ATX case. You see it's got a lot of expansion bays in it. Now for the motherboard, you see here we've got the Gigabyte H170 Gaming 3 motherboard. Now this board has the killer network interface card, it's got the Sound Blaster sound chip on it, a bunch of other great bells, whistles, and features, great value. For the CPU, I've selected the Intel Core i7-6700. Now this is Intel's 6th generation Skylake processor, socket 1151, and it comes included with its own fan and heatsink, and we're going to go ahead and utilize that on this build. For RAM, we've got G.SKILL 16 gigs of DDR4. Of course, you want to know about the video card, right? So we've got the GeForce GTX 970. This is from EVGA, and it's all going to be powered by a Corsair 750 watt semi-modular power supply. And as you can see on top here, we've got an ASUS DVD reader writer for the optical drive. And for our storage, we're utilizing a great value here. This is the SanDisk 480 gig solid state drive. And the price on that is what I was paying for 250 gig drives just about a month or two ago. So it's a great value for the amount of storage and the speed you're going to get from that solid state drive. And to tie it all together, we need an operating system. And for that, we've got Microsoft Windows 10 Home 64-bit edition. Now to get started, we're going to prep our case. And to prep the case, the first thing we have to do is pull the two side panels off. You'll see we've got two screws holding in this side panel, two holding in this one. We're going to go ahead and just unscrew these. We're going to just pull this back a little bit, and it's going to come straight off. Now, one of the questions I often see in the comments is, where do all the screws come from for mounting all the parts inside? Well, every brand new case, regardless of who makes it, is going to come with a little bag of hardware or a little box of hardware, which is what we have right here. They've mounted it in one of the hard drive trays, and if I just squeeze the two plastic pieces together here, the hard drive tray will come out, and then we just bend it with our hands and pull the box out. And for now, we'll just put the hard drive tray back in. We will get to that later. Inside of this box, we have different types of screws, nylon zip ties. So I'm going to go ahead and set these all aside for right now. And to prep the case, we need just 3 components on this build, and that's our drives and our power supply. So the first place I want to start is with the optical drive. The case, depending on which case you have, may operate a little differently as far as how these panels come out or how many panels you have. With the Corsair 500R, I'm just going to reach my hand in behind the top panel and just push it forward until it comes out. Because the drive, the optical drive, is accessible from the front, it installs from the front. You do not install it from inside. So very easily, we line the drive up with the hole that's there, and you just push it in, and you will hear it click into position once it's flush. Here we go. You've installed your optical drive. Pretty difficult, right? If we ever want to release that optical drive, here on this case, and again, different cases vary, for focusing on the 500R in this build video, has a unique release system here where you just slide forward this lever, and then you can push the drive right back and take it out again. Now it's time to install our solid state drive. This is the SanDisk 480 gig solid state drive. I know some people have had some confusion with regards to a solid state drive versus a hard drive versus an M.2 drive. We do have a video that explains all the differences. You can have multiple types of drives all combined in the same system. For this customer, they just need the one drive. They don't have a lot of storage needs, but they can certainly add more drives in the future. We can install it in any of these positions. How do you decide? Well, you got to think about what your cabling is going to end up looking like when you're done. And if you say, well, look, I've never done it before, I don't know what my cabling is going to look like when I'm done because I haven't done it before, it doesn't really matter at this point which drive tray we install it in because we can always move it around later. Now, installing a 2.5-inch hard drive into a 3.5-inch drive caddy is actually very simple. It's just that because the mounting holes are on the bottom of everything, we have to turn everything upside down. So again, remembering that where we're grabbing it is considered the front, and where the connectors are here on the drive is considered the back. We want the back of the drive to be flush with the back of the caddy. So I'm just going to line these up, and really only need to line up one at a time. Don't worry about lining up the other 3 at this point. And we're just going to start. We don't want to tighten the screw. We just want to start it, and it's going to hold that drive into position for us. And now we're going to repeat that with the other 3. And the installation, are you ready? Because if you blink, you might miss it. Looks a little something like this. Line the caddy up and then slide it forward. Now, the installation of the power supply can go in one of 2 ways. It can go in with this fan facing down. On this case, you'll see we actually have holes here on the bottom of the case. And that's designed because this fan here on the bottom of this power supply sucks air in. It doesn't blow air out. It brings air in from this side, and then it blows the air out from this side. So the air, it doesn't actually go into the case. It's just for the power supply. What happens for some people is when you mount this down with the fan in the down position, as it's intended with this case, and you have thick carpeting, you end up with a really expensive vacuum cleaner and a power supply that overheats. So it's important you have enough clearance that your computer, or rather your power supply, can breathe properly. So keep that in mind when you decide where you're placing your computer. If you have to put it on carpeting that's thick and you're a little nervous about it, you can always put it on a couple of books or blocks just to get a little bit of gap here so that fresh, cool air can come in and keep your power supply nice and cool. Or you can flip the power supply upside down and have it bring the hot air from your case into your power supply and then blow it out through the back, as it's going to do anyway. I prefer the cold air from outside rather than the hot air from inside. Also, the cabling here is going to be facing out if we install this power supply with the fan facing up, and that's going to make our cabling not look as appealing. Now, installing the power supply is also very easy to do. On this case, you'll see there's a little metal bracket right here in the back, and we want to install the power supply where that metal bracket is going to be on top, holding the power supply down. And to do that, we're just going to slide it gently into position, again making sure our fan faces down, and push it back so that it's flush against this motherboard tray. Once you've got it in that position, then you can push it back this way so that it becomes flush with the back of the case. Now we can secure the power supply into position. I recommend using the screws that come with the power supply. However, if the power supply you have didn't come with any, of course you can optionally use the screws that came with the case. And you'll see that there's numerous places for us to put screws here, but actually we only want to put a screw in each corner. And I want to emphasize, I don't want you to force anything. Everything should go in very easily. Now, the final step in prepping our case involves installing the motherboard I/O shield. Now, the I/O shield is included with your motherboard. It'll be in the box. So temporarily grab your motherboard box, find this I/O shield and remove it, and take it out of its packaging. Installing this is so easy you're not going to believe it. On the back of the case, there is a rectangular hole in the exact same size and shape as this I/O shield. We're simply going to push that in until it clicks into position. Now it's time to prep our motherboard for installation. And you want to hold the board by the edges as much as possible, just barely, the very bare minimum of what it's going to take for you to pick this board up, avoiding touching anything metal. So in this case, I can reach in and I can actually grab one of these PCI ports right here, and I can hold the board and lift the bag off. Now I can hold the board by its edges and safely place it on top of the motherboard box. The reason I'm going to place it on top of the motherboard box is on the bottom of the motherboard are all these solder points, and they're sharp and they will scratch up your table, they'll scratch up your countertop. Also, we don't want any sort of electrostatic discharge coming through the surface that you're working on. Now, this surface typically isn't going to conduct electricity. However, by placing it on the box, we're actually killing two birds with one stone by taking care of any electrostatic discharge potential, as well as protecting the surface of our work area. Now let's go ahead and get the CPU pulled out of the box. You'll notice one of the corners here on this plastic container that's housing our CPU has a little piece that's cut out of it, and that's intended for you to get your finger underneath and just lift that up. Now what we want to do here, and I want to emphasize this, we don't want to touch the surface of the CPU, not because it's fragile, but again, we want to keep any sort of contamination off of it so that the thermal compound that's on our heatsink will work most efficiently in transferring the heat. And for that reason, what they've done in this little plastic container is they've got these two little indents on each side so that you can reach in with your fingers and grab it by the edges, and you can hold it very safely without touching the top or the bottom. Now on the CPU, there is a small gold arrow, and that indicates which direction the CPU fits into the socket. So what we're going to do is start by lifting the retention lever on the CPU socket. We simply push down on this lever, and it's spring-loaded here, so it's going to come up a bit on its own, and we lift that up, and you're probably going to have to use your hand to go ahead and open that all the way up. Then I can gently set it into its socket. Again, the arrows are going to line up, and the little notch is also going to line up, and it's just going to very gently sit in position. Then we close the lid here and lower the retention lever back down. It's going to have a lot of tension, and this plastic cover should pop up all on its own once we lock it down. You want to take this plastic cover, put it away somewhere, because if you ever have to send this motherboard in for warranty work, or if you ever take the CPU out without putting another CPU in, it is critical that you protect those little pins by keeping them covered at all times. In fact, most manufacturers will not honor your warranty if you send the motherboard back without this little cover back in position. Now we can install our CPU, heatsink, and fan, so we can go ahead and remove this plastic cover that's been protecting the thermal compound that's been pre-applied by Intel here on the OEM fan. And when we install the fan, it doesn't really matter which direction we install it in. In other words, the fan can go on in any of these directions and work equally well. What I'm considering when I'm installing the heatsink is where the power cable is coming from that powers this fan. I'm going to rotate the fan with the cable coming out of the same side in the direction of where the power connector is that it's going to plug into. Now installing this would simply line up these individual towers here, and there's little holes around the socket that houses the CPU, and we're just going to fit those right over those holes, and then using a thumb, pick one corner and push straight down, and you will hear it click into position. Then, and this is really important, do the opposite corner, and then repeat with the remaining two. That's all there is to mounting the heatsink. We can now pick up the motherboard and handle it by grabbing onto this heatsink. Next, we can go ahead and plug our power connector in. Now the power connector has grooves on it, so it can only install in one direction, and it just simply slides into position. What I advise doing at this stage is to go ahead and grab one of the nylon zip ties that were included with the board, or if you have any extras, and go ahead and wire tie this wire before you install the motherboard into the case. It's a lot easier to do now. Now the last thing we have to do in prepping our motherboard is to install the RAM. Now when you hold the memory module, again, hold it by the edges as much as possible. If you have a heat shield on here, or as in this case it appears to be some kind of a sticker, it's okay to hold it just like this. What we want to avoid doing is touching any of the electronic components directly, and especially not this connector down here that they call oftentimes the gold fingers. Now the board has 4 memory sockets, and if you look very closely on the board, they're labeled DDR4-1, DDR4-3, DDR4-2, and DDR4-4. And that's aligned with each one of these sockets. We want to use sockets 1 and 2 first, and those are both of the red sockets. So to do that, we're going to open these retention levers up. Now on some motherboards the other side opens as well. Most modern boards I'm seeing now only one side opens, and that's perfectly normal. You want to align your memory module so that the cutout in the memory module aligns with the notch on the memory socket, and we're going to put it in completely straight and very gently. It should slide right into its track. Now, as long as it's seated correctly, you can use your thumbs and push down one corner and then the other corner. Go back to the container with our memory module, rotate the memory module in the proper direction, line it up with its track, set it down gently, one corner, other corner. Now we get to install our motherboard into our case, and to do this we want to lay the case flat so we're working with gravity rather than against it. On the motherboard tray here in the case there are what we call motherboard standoffs. What we want to be cautious of is that we don't have a standoff installed where there is no mounting hole on the board. So here's the back of the board. If you can imagine that you have a motherboard standoff somewhere where there's no hole, you'll never know it's there. And when you go to turn your system on, it could ground the whole system out and fry your brand new computer. So this is a very simple step, but a very important one. So that's why I count the number of standoffs and I count the number of holes. And then we do something called a dry fit, or at least I call it a dry fit. And that's where we take the board, we line up the ports on the board with the I/O shield, and we set it into position, and we look through the mounting holes to see if we can see the standoffs behind them. Now the center standoff has a little ridge on it, so it can actually fit down into the hole and hold the motherboard into position for us, which is what it's doing right now. Now if we go back to the little bags of screws that came with the case, we want to find the one that has these short, coarse threaded, flathead screws. These are the ones that are intended for mounting the motherboard. They give us a lot more than we need for this build, which is good. We have 6 mounting holes, we're going to need 6 screws. So we'll just go ahead and put the screw on there, and it doesn't matter where you start, but it is important that you don't over tighten these screws. Once you have all 6 screws started, then go ahead and start tightening them down. Now it doesn't matter what order you choose, just don't forget any. Now we get to the part that most people who've never built a computer before have the most anxiety about, and that's our cabling. And the way I'm going to show you this, it's very, very simple. Don't feel overwhelmed by all the cables. We're just going to handle it one cable at a time, and before you know it, it'll all be done. Now the very first cable that we're going to hook up is this 24-pin power plug, and that's going to plug into our 24-pin connector here on the motherboard. But before we just plug that straight in, now's a good time to think about how you want your cabling to look. And for many people, including myself, this is a very important matter. I want the inside of the computer to look nice and clean and hide as much of the cables as possible. And that's what these wiring grommets are for here. And you can use any of these. It's really up to your discretion. It makes sense to always use the one closest to where your cable is. So in our case, we'd run that right here through to the back. And we know we're going to plug it in here, so we're going to look for the closest wiring grommet, which is this one. We can push it through. Now this connector is only going to go on one way. Once you line it up, you should be able to just kind of wiggle and push on it and hear it click into place. And then give it a light tug to make sure it doesn't fall off, just to ensure that you've secured it into position. Next, we're going to take the 8-pin CPU connector. And you'll see it says CPU right there. And that is going to provide power to our CPU. And once again, we're going to go ahead and run that out through the wiring grommet, because that one's going to go way up in the top corner. We're going to pull this through as much as we can. And you'll notice right up here in the corner there's a cutout, and that's going to fit right in there. And if we turn the computer, we can reach in way up here in the top corner and pull that cable through, line it up, and again you should hear it click into position. Now remember all those cables that came with our power supply? Now we're going to take those out of the bag they came in, and we're just looking for one particular cable, and that's the one that's going to have our SATA power cable on it. I'll show you what that's going to look like. It is not any of these. Here we go. Here's one of them. Usually we get a couple of them, and the rest of these can be put back away. And we'll go ahead and remove the wire tie from this. And you'll see that this cable has one end that's different from the other. There are 4 connectors on the other end, and they're all identical, and it doesn't matter which one you use. It really is just a determination of what's going to look best, and we can actually power up to 4 devices with this if the cable will reach 4 devices. So we're going to start with this end of the cable and plug it into the back of the power supply. Now here on the back of the power supply, we have an area called peripheral and SATA. The area we're going to plug this in is any of these 4 connectors. Doesn't matter which one you use. So to keep everything looking clean, I'm going to plug in on the very bottom as close as I can get to the edge of that motherboard tray to keep our cabling as clean as possible. And you will hear it click when it's seated properly. Now we're going to take this end of the cable and we're going to run, the idea is we're going to power our drives with this cable. So we need to run the cable up to the optical drive and hopefully, if it'll reach, to our solid state drive. And that's why we can move the solid state drive around to accommodate our cabling. Now this connector is keyed. It's got a little notch on it, so it can only go in one way. We come back around, same cable. Again, thinking about what our cabling is going to look like, I can move this drive to where it may be looking better cabling-wise. Go ahead and plug that straight on to our solid state drive. And that connects power to both of our drives just that easily. Next, we can install our data cables. Now these cables are identical except that one of them on one end has a 90-degree bend on it. This one does right here. We're going to set that one aside for right now. This other cable, it's the same on both sides. Doesn't matter which side you start with. Much like the SATA power cables we just plugged in, it has the same shape, it's just a little shorter, and that can only go in one direction. And we're going to plug it here on the back of our solid state drive, and that should just lock right into position, which it's done. We're going to take the other end of this cable and we're going to run it right through the center wiring grommet and rotate the case to the other side, and we want to plug this into SATA port 0. There are 4 SATA connectors here. You'll line that up and then plug it straight on. Now while we're here, we can go ahead and plug in the next cable right above it. So take the remaining cable and plug it into what is SATA port 1, and we'll go ahead and run that right back out the same hole, and we can actually run it into the hole right above. And the 90-degree angle here will go right here on the back of the optical drive and lock right into position. Right up here on the top are our front ports, and the cables that power that we call our front port umbilicals. The one we're looking for to start with is our HD audio cable, and that's this cable right here, and right on the connector you'll see it actually says HD audio. Now on the back of this case we actually have a hole here that we can run this cable through. You'll see that one end of this cable has a pin that's blocked, and that ensures it can only go on in one direction. Here in the bottom left corner is our front port audio connector. We're going to plug the plug into that. It's just a friction fit. It doesn't click into place or anything. Next, we're going to hook up another very easy cable, and that is our front port USB 3 cable, and that looks completely different from any other cable in the computer. Make sure to line up the notch on the plug with the slot on the connector. So in this case, that notch is going to be on the outside edge, and there will be a little resistance as you press it on, and you should hear it click into position. The next set of cables we're going to hook up are the scariest of all of them, and Gigabyte has come up with a unique solution that makes this process so much easier, and it was, apart from being a little intimidating, still an easy process. But here we've got 4 individual cables, and they represent our power switch, reset switch, power LED, and hard drive LED. So each one of these has to go onto a specific connector on the motherboard. And so what Gigabyte has come out with is this thing called a G connector. Now the G connector actually tells us where all the cables are going to go on both sides. So we're going to start with this side that says HD, that's short for the hard drive LED, and you'll see that positive and negative are written there very small, with the positive end of the cable being closest to the edge of this connector. And if we use the HDD LED cable, we'll also see it's marked with positive and negative. Obviously we're going to align positive with positive, and we're just going to slide that right into its position here on the G connector, and it locks into position. Next, below that is the reset switch. Now switches, even though they may be marked as positive and negative, don't have a positive and negative. They actually don't. So you can't put the switch or the cable on backwards. It won't make any difference at all, as long as it's in the right place. And that's going to go right below the cable we just plugged in for the hard drive LED, and it will click into position. Now we can turn this connector around and repeat this process with the power LED and the power switch. With the power LED, it goes right above the hard drive LED with the positive cable, again going closest towards the edge, and slide them down into the connector, and that locks that into position. And then the final front port umbilical cable here is our power switch. It goes right beside the power LED, And now with our G connector fully populated, we can now very easily plug it right into the motherboard and be done with all the switches and LEDs with one plug. Now with the cables facing the left side, go ahead and plug this straight onto our front panel connector of the motherboard right here. Now the Corsair 500R comes with 3 fans already pre-installed. We've got 1 rear exhaust and 2 front intake fans, and we're going to go ahead and hook those up now. So we're going to start with the rear exhaust fan. Now this one has a 3-pin plug on it, and the motherboard will support a 3-pin fan or a 4-pin fan. We're going to plug in the 3-pin fan plug here onto the System Fan 1 header on the far right, where the grooves align with the tab, leaving the 4th pin exposed. And now we can hook up our 2 front fans. But what you'll see is we have a couple of fan cables here. This is a fan cable. This is another fan cable. And you see they're already plugged in. So our front fans, on this case, are already plugged in, but they still have to be provided power. And so that's what this connector is for right here. So to install this, we go back to all the cables that came with the power supply. And in all these cables, we're going to look for the one that's got that big, we call it a Molex connector, and it's this cable right here. This end of it, actually this end that says Type 4, this is the end that goes into our power supply. Also located under peripheral and SATA, and then we can run the rest of these cables right out the back, and now we can plug in our fan power right to the Molex connector like so. This completes our cabling at this point, and now we can test fire the system before we go any further to ensure that everything we've done so far works properly. There's no sense installing that video card just yet if what we have now doesn't work. Now I know some of you are thinking, how are you going to turn it on without a video card? Well, modern CPUs these days often have built-in video chips on them. They're not the best for gaming, far from it, but for general workstation use, they're fine. And even for casual gaming, they can be pretty impressive. And so you'll see the motherboard has the DVI and the VGA and the HDMI ports on it. All right, now here's where things get exciting because it's time for our very first power on self-test. So to verify everything's working so far, I've got a keyboard, a mouse, and power. Those are the only things we want to plug in. We don't want any USB drives or printers or even the network or internet. Keep all that unplugged for right now, because if it doesn't turn on for any reason, we want to make sure we minimize the number of things we have to diagnose that could be causing it. So you'll see the keyboard here that I'm using has a built-in trackball. So it's a keyboard and a mouse together. That saves a little bit of time in setting this up. And here I've got that USB cable. We're going to plug that into any USB port here on the back. Then of course we've got our monitor cable. In this case I'm just using the VGA cable. Not for any particular reason. We could use DVI or HDMI, but we'll go ahead and plug that right here on the back of the system. And the very last thing that we plug in is power. And before we plug this in, we want to make sure that the power supply is in the off position. That's for safety reasons. Now with it plugged in, now we can safely flip the switch on the power supply back to the on position. Now it's time to test boot. So just reach over here and we're going to hit the power button. Now in our case, hopefully we have something on the screen, and we do. It says that there is no bootable device. That's exactly the message I was looking for, and verifies that everything we've done so far we've done correctly. With our test boot being successful, we can now move on to installing our video card. Now just like the rest of our build so far, installing the video card is also incredibly simple to do. Using the first PCI Express slot, we want to push this lever, the retention lever, into the open position. Now before I seat the card in, I just want to line it up so I can determine which of these back slots I have to remove. So if I just line up the connector with the slot, I can see that I'm going to have to remove the second and third PCI Express covers. Now these slot covers just slide right out, and I recommend you put them in your motherboard box because you never know when you might need them in the future. And then align the groove in the plug with the groove in the socket here. Now with the card properly seated, we can secure it into position using the same screws we just removed. Now keep in mind that high-end video cards such as this GeForce GTX 970 that we're using in this build require their own power or they're not going to work. So we go back to the cables that came with our power supply. We're going to need one more of these cables. The remainder of the cables can go back into our motherboard box with the rest of our spare parts because we might need them one day in the future. What we're looking for in these cables is one labeled PCI-E. So you'll see here on one end of this cable, we actually have 2 plugs that say PCI-E, and there's a little 2-pin extension here, and that's to turn this 6-pin plug into an 8-pin plug, and that's to accommodate all different kinds of video card models. And as you'll see on our card here, it's going to require an 8-pin and a 6-pin. Here on the other end of the cable, it's labeled Type 4, just as it is on the end of all the other cables. Where it says Type 4, that's the end that goes into the back of the power supply. And just to keep our cabling as clean as possible, I'll just put it right beside the other cables we've already installed. Now, grabbing the other end of the cable, it doesn't matter which cable goes into which slot. We're just going to take that extra 2-pin there and add it to create the 8-pin connector that it needs. And with the clip facing down, go ahead and plug that straight on. Now the 6-pin connector we can use next, and we'll use some nylon zip ties to get that 2-pin connector out of the way. Again, with the clip facing down, it plugs straight on. Now it's time for us to test fire the machine one more time, only this time we're going to plug the monitor into the graphics card that we've just installed. And assuming it passes that test successfully, we can then begin the installation of our operating system. Now, just like before, we're only going to plug in 3 things: the monitor, keyboard, and power to the computer. Nothing else, for the same reasons I've already given. And again, the order is I'm going to plug in the keyboard and mouse combo first. Now, we have to use a DVI cable because I just realized our video card doesn't have VGA, so I've switched the cable out. I still could have used the VGA if I wanted to use the included DVI to VGA adapter that came with our video card, but I don't want to overcomplicate things. Now, there's a little plastic cover covering the ports on the back of the video card. Go ahead and remove that, and we'll plug our video cable in. And finally, we've got our power cable, but before plugging it into the power supply, make sure the switch on the back of the power supply is in the off position, and then go ahead and plug the power cable in and flip the switch on. All right, so here we go. Let's hit the power switch here, and what we want to see is some graphics appear on the screen, some text appear on the screen, something that tells us, well, for example this, that we're getting output from our video card that we just installed. And there's the error message we were looking for, that no bootable device is found. Now at this point, we're going to install the operating system, get it activated, download all the updates and the drivers, and then clean up the cable management, and then we'll come back and show you what the completed system looks like, as well as show you the performance benchmarks. All right, we'll do the reveal here, and you can see just how nice and clean that looks on the inside. And if we flip it around to the back, you can take a look at that as well. It's nice and clean that way. It's going to make it easier to work on in the future by having everything so neat. Also helps the airflow. And we went ahead and installed Windows 10 and did the activation and all the updates and drivers, and then ran the benchmarks. But before we show you the benchmark results, let's go ahead and turn this thing on and see how fast it boots in real time. So again, I've got my 3 cables here. Keyboard and mouse is going to plug in first. The DVI cable for the monitor I've got right here. We'll plug that in next. Again, being sure to plug it into our graphics card, not into our motherboard. And then we've got the power cable, so make sure the power supply switch is in the off position. Plug the power cable in. We'll flip the switch on the power supply to the on position. Then I'm just going to reach up here. I think the power button is right there. Yep, that was it. And first of all, very quiet system. And these microphones pick up everything, so you can tell just how quiet that is. And it's going to boot very, very quickly, as you're going to see here in just a moment. There we go. We're already at the desktop. It's blazingly fast. And as you can see, there's lots of room here to upgrade or to expand the system to future needs. So that's the great advantage of getting a case that's much larger than you need, not only to improve airflow, not only is it easier to work on, but the options that are available to the customer who owns a case like this are almost limitless with regards to water cooling, adding more cards, adding more storage, RAID arrays, all that's available for something to consider when you're going to purchase a case for your build. Now let's take a look at the benchmarks and see how well it performed. Here are our 3D Mark results. And here are our Crystal Disk Mark data transfer results. Now that's going to wrap up another build. I sure hope you enjoyed it. We've got more builds coming up, but let us know what you think of this one. Leave a comment in the section below, and be sure to check out our new video shopping platform at Newegg.tv. Thank you for watching DIY Garage. I'm Carey Holzman, and I'll see you next time. Bye for now.